Welcome to Safety Last with your host, Stanley Ching.
All right, everyone, welcome to the second or third, depending on when I post this, but one of the earlier episodes of Safety Last. Today we have Chris on the phone, on the mic. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, my name's Chris. I'm based in Toronto, Toronto in Canada. I am a young professional living in the city. Classic Asian American dream, living the dream. And yeah, I'm friends with Stanley, and he said he wanted to talk about Asian American media today. So here I am.
You know what? I'm not sure if this is like an American or Canadian thing, but I don't think I've ever heard another Asian in Sydney introduce himself as a young professional. So I feel like that's quite a title.
Oh well, I feel like it's a bit of a self-deprecating sort of statement because I don't know, the fact that I'm coming here talking about like Asian American art and just I feel almost as a bit of a poser just being like a corporate slave just going into
Oh,
the
got it,
office and then,
got it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
You know what's also really interesting, and I've said this to you before, but when it comes to media, so when I'm listening to the radio or podcast or television, and I hear an American accent or a Canadian accent, it feels very normalized because that's the only accent you really hear on television. Even in Australia, like a lot of our media is dominated, for better or worse, by Canadian or in particular American media.
Mhm, mhm.
But when I hear it, face to face, or when we talk, online, or when I'm talking to an American person or a Canadian person in real life, it's so jarring. It's so like immediate.
Yeah, and it's similar sort of deal for me. I obviously most of my exposures with the North American accent, but you think that hearing a Commonwealth accent or an Australian accent would be totally fine, but I do find I have to focus a little bit more in
Hmm.
order to full. It just doesn't not always fully picks up everything.
So, for example, do you find my accent? I guess it's harder to interpret. Is that what you're trying to say?
More like if, for example, I listened to your first episode, and if if it was done in an American accent, I feel like I wouldn't get lost. But
Mm,
if I'm brushing my teeth and my mind wanders, and suddenly I have to backtrack 30 seconds because I
got it.
lost myself. Yeah,
Got
yeah.
it. Got it. Um, I don't have that problem with the American accent when it comes to like media, and I think once again it's just purely up to exposure. But I do have a question, like I want to ask. So you're from
Mhm.
Canada.
Yeah.
There's a place in Canada called Quebec, which
Yes.
has a huge French population.
Yes.
Is there ever any tension between the French population and the, I guess, the English speaking population? And can you speak, like, do Canadians just learn to speak French because of Quebec?
Okay. So it's yeah. Wow. This is a bit of a loaded. This is like a pretty big question, I think. Yeah. So first of all, yes, there is a pretty big tension. Quebec is pretty proud of its French culture, its French heritage, and the majority of people outside of metropolitan Quebec, I would say, largely are French speakers.
Hmm.
And the rest of Canada is quite resentful of having to. So, in for rest of Canada public education, you have to take French from fourth grade to ninth grade.
Hmm.
So, and the rest of Canada is quite resentful of having to learn this useless language. Uh,
But French sounds so cool. I'm like really jealous that
yeah,
like it's in the education system.
yes, yes, and that's the thing. I imagine if that's the thing, it's so easy to learn French if you actually care, if you actually put in the work. So I'm a funny case. I actually had C's in Canada are like 60 to 69. I had C's in
Hmm.
French up until the ninth grade when I went to Quebec for a summer to do like a summer camp, and then I suddenly discovered confidence in French, and I kept on going
Hmm.
back to Quebec, and I started doing better and better. And then yeah, so at this point, I, it's quite rusty, but I would say I'm pro- professional fluency in, in French. Yeah,
Yeah.
so there are so many resources to learn French in Canada if you want to, but this really sad thing is that most people don't want to.
So that's such a shame, and I think that's quite common in Anglo-speaking countries. Oh,
Yes,
no, you mean
yes.
Anglo countries, not Anglo-speaking countries, where English is so dominant culturally, internationally, that people just don't feel like they need to learn it. So, like, I have other friends. For example, I have a Tunisian friend. She knows French, she knows Arabic, she knows English. I have another friend that lives in Germany, and the same thing, German, English, and I think she knows another language. So they're a lot more multilingual in
Hmm.
comparison to Anglo-Saxon countries.
Yes, yeah, for sure. Like it reminds me of like an old European joke where they're like, "Oh, if you speak three languages, you're trilingual. If you speak two languages, you're bilingual. If you speak one language, you're English." Like,
Yeah, there is some truth in that. But hey, before we jump onto our actual topic,
mhm.
can you say something in French?
Oui, je peux parler. Bah. What do you want me to say in French?
Okay. Can you say the weather's really nice and it might rain later?
Maintenant, il fait beau, mais peut-être il va pleurer un peu plus tard.
One day I'm going to learn French. I'm going to make it happen. One day, like one day, it's going to happen. But yeah, let's talk about the topic at hand, which is Asian art. So, let me just give a quick preface to why I wanted to do this topic, and why it's pretty important to me.
Mhm.
I think, and then afterwards, obviously, let's get your opinion. There's two reasons that comes to my mind. Firstly, I think, and I'm sure a lot of other minority people face the same thing. When you don't really have much representation, or you don't really see yourself in media or in politics or in any field that's widely accepted, there's a tendency to look at one's like ethnic or religious representation on media, and there's almost like a sense of attachment or investment in that. So I think on a practical level, I think what was shown in the media about me, or about other minorities, religious or ethnic, or whatever, or social class, like there is a sense of that is how other people see me, because that's the image that gets repeated a lot. So on one hand, I mean, just from a practical level, I guess it impacts people like me, and other people around the world. On the other hand, and this is what also interests me as an English and history teacher. I think studying art is one of the best ways to understand a society, because art is inherently produced by society and by the people in society who obviously they just they take in the social values, or the historical I guess just the history behind a society, and their art is often a reflection of that. So I think it's really interesting to chart the changes in art and what that's saying about a certain community. And obviously, being Asian, that's this is a community I obviously I'm quite invested in, but I also feel like I understand why the art has changed or remained the same. So I guess I'll throw it over to you. Like, because you, just from what I've seen, like you've written articles on this, and we've talked about this before. Why were you interested in art, or in particular art from an Asian lens?
Yeah, yeah. I think you nailed a lot of it, and you also the part about the change in art was something I really hadn't even considered. So that was a big one. For me, I think my honestly my I was a big reader growing up and got into movies maybe like a few years ago, and I
Hmm.
think up until recently my favorite pieces of art were all in the tradition of dead white men. Like
Hmm.
I love
Can you give me an
Fitzgerald.
example?
Yeah, like
Fitzgerald.
Fitzgerald. Like
Hmm.
This Side of Paradise is like one of my favorite books. Like
Hmm.
um, and or like in terms of movies, like the Before trilogy
I
was
love
like
that trilogy.
right, and like it's all just like white people, and that was like fine for me. Like I never like I grew up in a largely Asian American community, and so I never really felt uncomfortable in my own skin.
Hmm.
And but once again, with the advent, actually, Australian mentioned crazy, not crazy, but subtle Asian traits,
Hmm.
and with which really got me thinking about sort of this like sort of pan Asian identity a little bit more, and then that coincided with Crazy Rich Asians, and just all of these things sort of all happening at once led me to kind of reflect a little bit more about Asian art, what it means, why it's important. There's more of it. So I guess one criticism that I've heard a lot about this sort of, I mean, obviously on social media you see a lot of like very far right or left perspectives, and this a very far left perspective is like, oh, why is representation so important? It's just studios realizing that they can make monies off minorities as well. And I think this is like true to a certain extent, but just I also think like some of these things aren't necessarily for me who grew up like in an ethnic enclave, right? It's like for the I don't necessarily have an Australian example, but like the Asian kid who's the only one in his class in Midwest like Oklahoma or something, and like seeing, oh, there are other Asian people and like in subtle Asian traits, and like, or they see Crazy Rich Asians and they see Asians portrayed in a different way, and they can see and other people in that community can also see Asians portrayed in a way that's not just Ken Jeong doing whatever Ken Jeong's doing, or
monolithic.
Exactly. So I think it is important. Obviously, it's having that be the end all be all, and like, yay, capitalism is going to come and save us is like, oof, a little too convenient, I would say. But like, I think it definitely is important, and like you said, the idea of how changing representation is about, like, it shows how society as a whole is changing and perspectives on Asians in society are changing, I think is a very good point too.
And this is actually I guess a talking point that I heard from another podcast, which I felt was really interesting, and I guess I'll just recite it here. They brought up this issue of Simu Liu, who we can talk about later. Which the big question, Chris, why are you not a fan of Simu Liu? But we'll get to that. We'll get to that afterwards. But Simu Liu, for anyone who doesn't know, he's an actor in what's it, Kim's Convenience, and he got casted as Shang-Chi in a new Marvel film, I think.
Right.
Okay, good. And he, and the podcast said, okay, so obviously he's breaking stereotypes, he's breaking the mold. He's an Asian who's like, the main protagonist. So this is pretty important in terms of, like, I guess the history of Asian actors or Asian media in the West. Almost like Crazy Rich Asians, in some ways you could say, was somewhat of a turning point. On the other hand, the question that was brought up is what happens, for example, if Simu Liu in this film is very pro-military, or very militaristic, or like supports some ideas which are maybe not that progressive, or maybe not that I don't know what another word is, kind, I guess, not that progressive. Like, does that does that contradict the push towards equality or whatever? Like, just because it's got an Asian face on it, does that necessarily mean it is by nature better? Yeah, like I guess, what are your thoughts on that? And then I'll add after that, what are your thoughts on Shang-Chi? Like, have you watched the trailers and stuff?
Yes. Wow, I love this. So the first talking point is more on how this sort of big Asian reveal, and if he, God forbid, missteps, or this role portrays he has negative sort of views or actions in this role, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really big. I think this is
Wait, sorry. Can I just interrupt you there for 1 second? And just to elaborate on my point is, in Shang-Chi, he, from what I know, he actually fights his like father, who's like almost a caricature, Fu Manchu, of like the predatorial Asian. So
yes.
if he is
Yes.
like if he fights his father and he beats the predatorial Asian, the Asian dad, or the Asian figure, and he does it through like coming out and being very militaristic, or whatever, like, does that is that necessarily a win for the community? I guess, does that make sense?
Yes. Those are okay. Yes. So I actually had a lot of thinking about this point too. But so let's start with the first point. I guess it's now you can see it's more of a tangent, but the idea of I've been thinking a lot that I have too high expectations for Asian American media, in that
Mhm.
I generally expect the piece or the actors they have to be flawless and tell the entire Asian American story, because there's so few of it, there's so little of
Mhm.
it, and
Absolutely.
we need more investment in it. And recently, I've just tried to convince myself that it's really not fair to have this sort of expectation. Like, I'm watching like Minari or Tiger Tail, and like they were like phenomenal movies, but at the same time, I felt like they could have been better. They just felt like Oscar bait with like Asian people. And
Really? Even Minari? I loved Minari. That
okay,
was
yeah,
amazing.
like
But
that's
go,
what I
yeah.
mean. I think maybe like my expectations like way overblown. Like
Mhm.
it's just the act, it's the director, it's the writer just telling their own story, right?
Mhm.
They never claim to speak for all Asians living in America. It's not they don't want to capture the whole Asian American immigrant experience. They're just telling their own story.
Yep.
And in that sense, I think once again, this is a bit of a tangent, but I think this is something that I and maybe other people have to contend with, in terms of this is one piece and hopefully what will become a collection of Asian American media, and that these should be held to this unrealistic standard.
Mhm.
Whereas like mo- more traditional mainstream movies, they can tell any one singular aspect of the story with nuance, and no one's going to expect them to encapsulate the whole like
Absolutely.
American experience, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is I think the reason behind that, unfortunately, is there are just so few Asian media. I guess Asian media in the West, Asian American. I think that's what you called it. Media
Yes.
in the West, and because of that, each example becomes almost representative, fortunately or unfortunately. And I'm sure, for example, you've been called Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan, and I love Bruce
Yeah.
Lee, I love Jackie Chan, but the reason these nicknames or these stereotypes stuck was because there was nothing to challenge a very monolithic media stereotype or representation. So unfortunately, whether Simulu actually comes out and he wants to champion himself as the representative of Asian media, or Asians in the West, etc. Unfortunately, whether he does it or not, I think he will get that treatment regardless, and I don't
Right.
think it's fair.
No, it's definitely not. And yeah. I guess like onto your point about the um, yeah. So your second point was really, another friend actually brought it to my attention, and it like kind of clicked what was wrong with the biggest problem I saw with the Shang-Chi trailer. And that like the way we discussed it was, once again, this could have been once lifted from whatever you saw it from, was that seemed like it was like the good Asian versus the bad Asian, like in the Fu
Mm,
Manchu example, or like Tony Leung seems to be playing the cosmopolitan mega city, like nouveau rich Chinese,
hmm.
whereas Simu Liu's like, the guy in America who's just like doing his own thing,
Yeah,
being an
wears
Asian American.
hoodies. He
Yeah,
he goes to uni. He rides a beaten down car. Sort of average Joe Asian
right,
American.
right, and yeah, I think this is like a really good point. I'm glad I'm glad it struck you as well, because I think it's like this is there's a degree of nuance here which I don't necessarily think this movie is like equipped it to handle.
Hmm.
Like I think it's okay to have. It's difficult. It's difficult because like I don't know about how it is in Australia or how it was for you, but growing up, I think there in a mostly Asian community, there was still a very strong desire among the I guess we consider ourselves Canadian-born Chinese, like CBC, but for the foreign-born Chinese, or the 1.5, generation twos, to differentiate themselves against the people who come later, against we would, in a rather derogatory sense, call them fobs, but
Hmm. Yep.
and like we are not like them. We are not Chinese. We are westernized. We are X, Y, and Z,
Yep.
and
Yep.
and and I think, I mean, I hope this sort of differentiation no longer persists. But I feel like it still does to a certain extent, and
Hmm.
this further sows this discord, right? Because you have, I don't know, in like even going to college and being, I'll just say Canadian Chinese, and seeing like international students come in, and then sometimes they have money, sometimes they're dressed loudly in brands, and like I think as I grew through the college experience, I became less and less intolerant, and like I
Hmm.
realized that, yeah. But I think there were still many people who'd be like, no, these are not us. They are just rich, nouveau rich Chinese. Oh my gosh,
Hmm.
they're
Hmm.
embarrassing us. And I think this movie sort of exploits that divide almost. It
Interesting. That's a really interesting point. And actually talking about this, us and them mindset, this idea that hey, we are better because our accent is more mainstream, more streamlined
Mhm,
when it comes to speaking English. I actually felt that exact same way in high school. I remember I went to a school uh, where there was, I guess, a lot of white people, Europeans, and when I was walking to the bus stop and we come across another school um, close by, which had a lot more Asians. When I was young, and I was pretty regretful of it at the time. And right now, I'm pretty regretful of it. But I was 16. Part of me, whether that was classist because I went to a private school, or racial, or something of the a combination of both. There was a tendency for me to almost like look down or distance myself away from, as you said, and it is a slur, the fobs,
mhm,
because I was better, because my accent was smoother, because I could, I don't know, watch Simpsons without subtitles or whatever stupid reason it was. Like there
mhm,
was this desire to brand yourself as high on the hierarchy. But what's interesting, and I'm not even sure if we have time to talk about this because there's so many topics when it comes to this, to this field because I think it's relatively unexplored. What's interesting is I find nowadays the younger generation, um, there is a lot more pride in being Asian in something that I would say the slightly older generation, if I were to include myself in that, we didn't have. And I think part of the reason is a lot of Asians in Sydney, in Melbourne, in New York, or in Vancouver,
mhm,
they look towards Asia as a as the hub of Asian entertainment. And I think a lot of the older Asian stories, whether it's the only one I can think of is like Joy Luck Club, or even some of the older Wong Fu stuff, which
mhm,
were quite assimilationist. So, to anyone listening out there, just the idea of like fitting in into society and doing it to ensure positive results. I think that's almost been replaced somewhat because of just the explosion in manga, or whether it's K-pop or K-dramas. I feel like a lot of Asians look towards Asia as really the point of, uh, I guess, a point of cultural identity. And before I throw it over to you, and just looking at how the transition of art happens, a lot of the newer art, whether it's Crazy Rich Asians, Tiger Tail, and I'm sure I'm missing a lot more. These, or even just K-pop and stuff. A lot of these stories are about actually returning to Asia,
mhm.
juxtaposed to really finding an identity in the West. So yeah, I know I threw a lot at you, but what are your reactions?
Yeah. Like I've had, well, long story short, my relationship with my sort of Asian American, I use Asian American for lack of a better term, but I totally extends to Australia as well. Like Asian Western identity
Hmm.
is largely like I grew up in an ethnic enclave, never really questioned my race or never even considered racism. Went to a predominantly white college, was like, oh, racism does exist in certain places.
Hmm.
And then I went to, and then like I spent a summer in Shanghai, and then like I started learning to read and write Chinese a lot more, and then became more immersed in this sort of stuff. And sorry, where was I going? Yes, so in terms of that, I think it's based on my current reflections. I think it's kind of, it's almost, I I think it's good that Asians have an Asian sort of homeland to turn to, that's producing high quality content, that
Mhm.
is a developing place. A place that is well developed now, I guess, and can be a source of pride. But at the same time, I really want to see some sort of, like you mentioned, like an Asian American identity emerge. That's not just offshoots of the Asian stuff. And I have nothing against the entire Korean pop culture. I have nothing against manga. I have nothing against some of the Chinese films of late haven't been that great, but like honestly, Chinese cinema is still pretty great. Hong Kong cinema is pretty great. Like I have nothing against that, but I do want to see, like, I look at a lot of the other, once again, this is not an us versus them sort of issue, but just for lack of a comparison, I look at the other ethnic minorities in North America, and you see, like, you see African American culture, you see like Latino culture, like they all have really strong culture, really, like there's really cool stuff coming out. They have great art that's not defined on, I mean, there's some Pan-Africanism, there's some back to Africa, but like it's uniquely African American, it's uniquely Latino, it's uniquely American,
Mhm.
not in something that's very detached from their home culture. And I don't know where I stand with it, but I think to a certain extent it can be a little bit crippling if
Well, do you think this, for example, let's just take African American culture because I listened to an obscene amount of hip hop when I was younger, so I'm a little more well versed in that. Would you say this is true? And once again, just keep in mind, being in Australia, I'm very far away from, I guess, the origins of African American culture or art. But would you say that one reason the African Americans were able to produce such unique art is, firstly, they were there, I guess, longer for a longer period of time,
Mhm, mhm.
so there's almost like they've assimilated, I guess you could say, more. And secondly, could you say that because Asia is quite wealthy, or it's fairly wealthy right now, especially East Asia, um, it's quite easy to almost fall back into that because it is a continent that is producing a lot of art and at a greater pace. And on the other hand, if you were African American, it might be harder to, I guess, fall back to African art, which doesn't have, I guess, the same production value, in my opinion, or the same, the quantity or the same economic support behind Asian, especially East Asian art. So, do you think there's almost like a contextual, historical, economic reason why Asians are, for example, falling back to K-pop, which is, becoming really, really big, or K dramas, or anime or something, in a way that Latinos or I guess African Americans are not.
Yeah, no, I agree. There are a multitude of reasons that I think like African American. Well, once again, I hate to just use that singular example, but like, yeah, African American art is so much more developed. I think like there's African Americans have been in America for much longer. The population is much larger. There's this sort of shared sense of trauma, and like I'm not saying, oh no, if we had the shared sense of trauma, things would be a lot better. But like there's all these reasons, but and
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
makes a lot of sense. But I would really like to see a similar sort of thing for Asian American art. And
Where do you think the art will move towards? Like, do you, and I'm once again I'm lifting things off another podcast or an article that I read or listened to previously, and something that this magazine or this podcast said was they really wanted Asian art to move beyond what they called like the stinky tofu story, which is, you're a 5-year old kid, you come from Kyoto, and then you bring tofu and people laugh at you. I mean,
mhm.
that's a pretty common experience amongst minorities. um and like, so are you like, where do you think Asian art will move towards, and like what sort of hope, what idea do you want it to embrace? If you're talking about like, you want Asian American or Western Asian art to be more unique or developed.
Yeah. Excellent question. Like once again, I actually don't know where it would have to necessarily go, and I see your point where like a lot of the Asian American storytelling right now is based on the fact that, oh, people were racist to me and this was bad. And like, once again, this is a very valid story, but like, I think that's what one end of the spectrum right now, and the other end of the spectrum is like something like Ishiguro, where like he's Japanese living in the UK, I think, and his stories are, for large part, his more popular stories are actually quite English.
Mhm.
And
Is
they're
this the
very,
book writer? Is this the
yes,
novelist?
yes, like
Okay.
Never Let Me Go, Remains of the
Yeah.
Day. Yeah,
Yeah.
and they're like, if you scrubbed his Japanese name off, you could have, imagined it was like Anthony Hopkins writing or something. And I think like those are like the bookends of the spectrum. And I think like in between, I think there is room to maneuver where where you don't have to be, where not everything the artist does has to be necessarily tinged or has to focus on this Asian identity, but
Mhm.
it's tinged with it to a certain extent. And I
Mhm.
think,
Sorry to interrupt, but I think that's why I love Minari, because to me, I guess there was touches of the Asian identity. Um, uh, by the way, if people listening have never heard of Minari, highly recommended. One of my favorite films. I actually think it was better than Nomadland. But anyway, regardless, great film, and it's about a Korean family that moved to America. But one thing I really liked about it, and I'm sure we share the same opinion. This is not to say films like Crazy Rich Asians, which are more centered on the Asian identity, are not useful. But to me, like Minari was about like a family, and like really about the father finding a purpose, and the Asian aspect was just another part of it, but wasn't the main part of it. And I guess I appreciate it. It was a piece of Asian art, or Western Asian art, that wasn't just centered about being Asian, or the stinky tofu story.
yeah, yeah, exactly. That's a really good point that I didn't actually think about. But yeah, that's definitely something I was like going for. Like, and just in terms of Asian American artists, like even in like, I don't know, like in music, you have a few coming up. You have, I don't know, who do we have in music?
88 Rising. We got Joji. We have who else? Rich Brian,
Yeah, yeah.
and
Well, I mean, Higher Brothers are pretty Asian, but yeah, yeah, no, no.
yeah,
There's music. You have.
Nikki. Who else? I'm just listing everyone off 88 Rising.
No, but like, even like, I don't know. I'm thinking about like in the culinary space. If you consider that art, like Eddie Huang is pretty Asian. He's like, that's part of his,
Yep. Yep.
that's pretty big part of his identity. But you
Yep.
also like have Dave Chang. You have like, I feel like there's like a lot more, and it's understandable why the first generation of Asian Americans had to just be, young professionals and make money because
Hmm.
they had to make money. But now that there are more Asian creatives in the space, I think they can begin to start telling stories and doing things that aren't always focused on the Asian. So,
Hmm. Yeah.
and I think I see it happening. So,
Yeah. And I think to your point, talk about you saying that the first generation had to be um I guess young professionals, like that's really talking about art through an economic lens. Just the first generation just need to hustle, because otherwise, how can they find a hooding, not hooding, a footing in society? And I feel like taking this economic lens, if we look at Asian art in Asia, I think that's part of the reason for its resurgence is purely just because Asia is simply wealthier. And um like I love a lot of American art and a lot of American, I guess, fashion and stuff, jeans and stuff like that. That's really cool. But I think part of the reason it got so famous, t-shirts, Mickey Mouse, Disneyland, all this stuff, was because from the 50s to the early 2000s, America was the undisputed economic capital. And
mhm.
I think this shift, as Korea or Japan or Thailand get wealthier, I think art will increasingly try to move towards or I guess at least draw from that a little more. And have you watched the trailer for Snake Eyes? Or have you watched any other like Asian art recently? Whether it's what's it called, Raya and the
Last Dragon,
yeah,
right?
Raya and the Last Dragons. Like, yeah, I guess I know I'm throwing a lot at you again, but have you watched any Asian art recently? And then what's your
Um,
response to the to my comment about saying that just the economics, the simple economics of Asia, will inherently draw more Asian creators towards that sort of storytelling or those sort of values from Asia?
that's uh, hmm. It's I guess I haven't really considered um, Asian American art in the context of like the influence of Asia only in that the now because of China's rise and how it's set up against the West now, it's in it's in the media's interest now to like often portray China as the villain.
Hmm.
Like only in that context, I would say. Let me think. What have I seen? I'm just looking at my letterbox right now. I watched Boogie, which was Eddie Huang's film, but that wasn't very much.
Hmm.
Um, hmm.
Like I have a thing where I try to watch as much Asian art as possible,
Right, right.
or Western Asian art. And part of the reason is, I guess, as as someone who's trying to write a book, or really at the end stages of writing a book, like I've always been interested in art. I've always, as an English teacher as well, I've always loved art. But another reason I do it is just to keep a finger on the pulse of like like the Asian community. And there's been a few like Over the Moon and stuff, cartoons,
Oh yes, I've
Rare
seen.
Lust
Yeah.
Dragon, where it tends to like, once again, talking about like the growing influence on of Asia on Asians. Like a lot of these stories are centered in Asia. Like they're centered in
Hmm.
Hong Kong, or they're centered in Osaka or something like that. So I feel like there's a general shift, you know, towards that direction, just because of the cultural and economic capital of Asia. What do you
I
think?
mean, I see what you mean with like I'm just looking at this list of movies. I like Tiger Tail is a lot like that, and like one of my I really liked The Farewell.
Yep, I liked
Yeah,
Farewell. Yep.
yeah, and the Farewell is definitely like that. But even then, I think it was a lot of it was a most of what I've seen is still in the Asia westernized Asian goes back to Asia and wow, it's different.
Hmm.
And I guess I still don't see. I guess maybe it's just this prejudice I'm still holding in that I see the I see like a gulf between Asian American and Asian, and I don't necessarily think it will be bridged.
Well, at least not for a while. Like there definitely is a cultural bridge. I guess my point is more. I think as time progresses, that bridge will inherently lessen. I think compared to what the art was saying 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, I
Okay.
think there's been quite a change. I don't know. That's my opinion. What do you think?
Um, I okay. In fairness, I don't necessarily see it in based on like the new art that is coming out, but I do see it based on just like public opinion, like you mentioned, the how it's become more socially acceptable to be into anime and manga, and more socially acceptable to be into the entire Korean K-pop songs,
Hmm.
Korean dramas,
Hmm.
and like yeah, like watching things with subtitles has become like more acceptable. Like Korean cinema is having it's like a huge heyday right now,
Hmm.
and I think that like society as a whole is coming around to it, and I think obviously Asian Americans are are, are at the front of this sort of charge. But I yeah I would I don't I guess I just haven't seen enough art where I see it's the strong Asian influence on the Asian American production.
Mm, yeah. I think yeah, I I see some truth in what you're saying, and that the art from from Asian America, it might simply try to reach towards Asian values or even use Asian aesthetics, but I
Yes,
think
yes.
fundamentally there is still a cultural gap. But I think that's inevitable. Like even if you look at within the continent of Asia, like like Japan and Korea, or Thailand and Indonesia, like these places are somewhat close to each other and they share cultural similarities, but I think fundamentally it would inherently be some differences, and I think I don't think our points contradict. I think it's
Mhm.
natural to have that, but I still see overall like this general trend.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll keep my eyes peeled for sure.
Mhm. So I guess I'll return back to another question that I asked before, which is where do you want the art to go? Like what are some ideas you would like the I guess new age, or I guess the most recent movement of Asian art to talk about?
Mm, mm. Yeah, I think, I mean, one problem I've had with sort of Asian American stuff, and this, once again, this could just be me not seeking out more of the content, but is I I find that Asian American stuff is very often like quite big studio, quite commercialized. It's like the distribution is quite widely available, and that's not a problem, but that like it seems to be very commercial.
Can you
A
give me an
lot of,
example?
like, for example, like Crazy Rich Asians,
Okay, yep. That's the
right?
most
Yeah,
obvious
like,
example.
yeah,
Yep.
that I mean, yeah, that is the example that comes to mind. And like obviously there's like smaller stuff, indie stuff that comes out, but even like Tiger Tail, I think it was like a Netflix distribution. And like it's good. It's good that this sort of stuff exists, but I I can't help thinking that like art needs to come out of. I'm just surprised that it's so mainstream already. And maybe, once again, maybe it's because maybe I'm pulling at strings here, and I just haven't taken the time to look at the more independent stuff that's coming out.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is like something I touched on earlier with the Asian American culture. I I don't like. I want the art to be the backbone of this culture, right? Like, and I think art can be what drives the culture forward. And I don't want the thing that we as Western Asians to rally around is like Crazy Rich Asians.
No,
Like,
no.
yeah,
Good,
right?
good lord, no.
Or like bubble tea, or like, I mean, and once again, Asian American culture is young, it's growing,
Mm.
it's still small, and we need something. But yeah, that's I wanted to see, yeah, that's I don't know where it will go, but I want to see something beautiful and something unique.
Yeah, and hopefully, talking about the Crazy Rich Asians, like and maybe once again, this talks about the point where it's unfair for us to expect any piece of art to to I guess cover all demographics. But obviously, Crazy Rich Asians talks about a select few, which most people, not even talking about Asians, cannot relate to.
Mhm.
Like 1% of the 1% can relate to the lifestyle of of people that rich, and in a way, like I think that makes it almost impossible to build a culture around that. So,
Yeah, and another thing with Crazy Rich Asians is it also kind of sets up the Asian American versus Asian like dichotomy, where like Candace
mm,
Wu is us, and
mhm,
she is going to do battle with like, for lack of a better term, like
the
China,
matriarchy.
yellow peril. Yeah, exactly, right. And but once again, like, I think if it wasn't for Crazy Rich Asians, we wouldn't have seen the investment in the sort of Asian art that we've had of late.
Hmm.
So I don't know. It's hard to tell. Where do you want Asian art to go?
Uh, um, fundamentally, I think this is going to be somewhat of a cop out answer. I think fundamentally, it's not possible to direct art. Like it inherently has to be spontaneous. Any sort of cultural movement has to be somewhat spontaneous for there to be any lasting legacies. So I don't know where it will go. I have, I guess my hope would be that it looks it's less dismissive of Asia. I think that would be a hope.
Hmm.
It's less antagonistic towards people from Asia, like the fobs. The once
Yes.
again using that slur, and I hope it moves away from the almost the trauma of the stinky tofu story, and I think we can explore more things than having some jock with a football or basketball, push our drink bottle or our boba tea out of our hands. I think it can be more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day about this, but like, geez, I've been trying to read more like Asian American like literature too. I read Interior Chinatown. I don't know if
Hmm.
you've heard of Charles Yu.
No, unfortunately not.
Yeah, he's like a pretty the book is called Interior Chinatown. So like once again, this is more focused on the Asian American identity.
That's actually something that maybe that I wanted to say, which is there isn't much literature on on the Asian American experience, or
Hmm.
like I guess Western Asian experience. There
Right,
really
right.
isn't that much literature. The only book I can actually maybe I can think of two books. Joy Luck Club, which I haven't read or watched. I think that was a book and a film. I think, and
Yes,
also
yes.
Chinese Cinderella, which I don't know.
Ooh,
I haven't read
I
that
haven't
either.
heard of that one. Who's that one by?
I think no. I think that's an Australian Australian Chinese or
Oh,
Asian Australian person. So yeah, I'm not surprised that you haven't heard of it. But
that's cool.
that's one of the texts that we at my current school we have to study for in English in
Oh,
year 7, I think. So that's pretty cool.
hey, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a pretty cool aspect. The Australian education, like any other education, has its obvious negatives, but I think there are some positives. That some of they have tried to update the text, and I do give them credit for that.
Yeah, each of our countries has their share of problems with
That's true, but you know what? To be honest, like and maybe this is I'm ending on a pacifist sort of tone. But I really feel like you could say that about any country. Any country has its negatives,
mhm,
and its dark history, its positive. And to be honest, a lot of the media from Asia comes with like quite, I guess, questionable values as well. And just like any other
mhm,
area, like for example, if we were to look at K-pop, for example, the values or just the aesthetics or the contracts or the working conditions of those idols. They're not
right.
always very good either. But it is very catchy and very aesthetic, I guess. So it does sell out. But yeah, I think every country has its
Yeah,
flaws,
yeah,
and
for sure.
but that's why we talk about this is because if we don't challenge the narrative, then I think we leave ourselves exposed by what the people creating the narrative want us to absorb.
Hmm. Hmm. No, this is true. Like I at some point in the Canadian or the Ontario education system, we had to take these media literacy classes, which we
Hmm.
all thought were so dumb. But like this was like an elementary school. But
Hmm.
kind of think of it, this is like it's super important
Yeah.
to understand what this sort of culture factory wants us to see, think, and feel.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Cool. Anyway, I think we'll end it there. So, thank you, Chris, and thank you for tuning in. I'm sure we'll have him on in the future, and we'll have another fresh topic for you guys. So, take it easy. Catch ya.
Thank you for tuning in to Safety Last with Stanley Ching. If you enjoyed this, then please leave a rating or a comment. I hope you're leaving with a new idea, and make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and other places that can be found in the description.